Thank you, Peter, for your kind words about my work, and I feel very honoured and humbled to be following Peter and Wolfgang in this programme, because I'm a relative newcomer to the entire Australian scene of think tanks and debates about Western civilization. I've been in England really for the last 2 decades, with my head buried in books in the British Library writing about the Reformation, and very much, pertinent to Western civilization, but not really participating in the debate. Things have changed a lot this year. Most people in the room have come up to me and talked about the audit of the history subjects, which has just made such a huge impact on the debate on Western civilization. But my talk today is not really about the audit so much, because I'm actually quite tired of talking about it. So what I thought I would do was focus on Britain, because that's where I've been living for the last 20 years, and that's really where our origins of our freedoms come from, in a utilitarian way. So last year, Professor David Flint gave a speech to the Order of Australia Association about the fact that young Australians are just not being taught about their British heritage. Incidentally, I met Professor Flint on Monday night at the launch of the Ramsay Centre Foundations of Western Civilization programme in Sydney at a very fancy function at the Intercontinental. And I was amazed to meet him, because he's just has a wonderful mind, and I told him that I'd be talking about him in my talk today, and he was very chuffed. So in his speech, he also refers to a crucial golden thread, and Peter, you talked about a similar thread in terms of Christianity. He talked about the thread in terms of it is a thread that comes to us directly from Britain. It started with the Magna Carta, winding its way through Britain through the next 100 years of numerous defining moments in Britain's history, and ending up here in Perth in 2017. This golden thread is crucial because it carries with it the institutions, the laws, the customs, the rules, the rights, the codes of conduct, which determine the way we act with each other and the way we act and with government. And these institutions give us the freedoms. They give us the peace, the prosperity, and everything which characterised Australia as the successful nation which it is today, and which continues to attract people from all over the world. And I think these institutions are taken for granted. And they didn't originate in Asia, and Wolfgang, don't worry, I will be looking at Asia, although it's going to be impossible to fit it on my business card, which already is too long anyway. They didn't originate in the Middle East, and they didn't originate in continental Europe. They came to us from that extraordinary, very damp island, beset by terrible weather, blighted by pebbled beaches, and until the influx of very enthusiastic Australian baristas in the 2000s, thoroughly undrinkable coffee. Very, very terrible coffee. But that damp island's rich and utterly mesmerising history is our history. We have a claim to it. It belongs to us. Its institutions are our institutions, and its freedoms are our freedoms. However, to continue with Professor Flint's analogy, this golden thread is not only fraying at the end, but it's in danger of being severed altogether. Because quite simply, Australians aren't being taught that these institutions came from Britain. Of course, we know teachers and academics have much to blame for this state of affairs. As we're all aware, schools and universities, especially universities, as I discovered recently, are more concerned with peddling climate change and identity politics than they are with explaining to those in charge why they need to know about Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, or the Industrial Revolution, for example. Of course, it hasn't always been so. For most of Australia's history, since the settlement, the study of Britain formed the central part of history lessons in schools and universities. From the 19th century onwards, and particularly since Manning Clark popularised Australian history as a specialisation of study in its own right, most accounts of this nation's origins commenced either with the arrival of the first Europeans, the explorers in the region after the 16th century, or the landing of the first fleet in 1788. And a typical narrative of this kind might have commenced with a description of the difficulties faced by the first settlers in New South Wales, and then just leapt through the establishment of colonies in Van Diemen's Land and what is now Victoria, talking about things like arbitrary rule of British governors, the gold rushes, the Eureka Stockade, democracy, federation, Gallipoli, and so forth. These accounts tended to focus on the last 2 centuries in isolation, almost as if no earlier history is relevant to Australia's past. This then changed with Geoffrey Blainey's The Triumph of the Nomads, which he wrote in 1975. Blainey told the story of Aboriginal Australia prior to European settlement, and since then, historians have made sure to emphasise the fact that the colonists who arrived at the end of the 18th century did not settle an empty continent. Blainey has influenced a great many popular accounts of Australian history, which have since incorporated this extended version. But the problem is, while this new approach tells the history of Australian continent, which of course is itself is important, it fails to explain just why the history of Australia as a nation came together as a collection of institutions and culture, and that it didn't suddenly materialise in 1788. You might say that the pendulum has swung far too much the other way. Only a few decades ago, it wouldn't have been necessary to make the case for Australia's debt to Britain. But culturally, economically, internationally, and politically, Australia has since undergone a rapid phase of change. The British Empire is no more, and the United Kingdom's ties with Australia have significantly weakened. Australia has emerged as an independent nation with a distinct culture of its own, and with many people from non-Western nations now calling Australia home, and with the coming of the Asian century, there's been a tendency for many Australians to completely disassociate their country from its colonial past, and instead to emphasise its indigenous heritage and its connections with other nations in the Asian region. It's telling that Asia and Australia's relationships with Asia and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and culture were two of the three cross-cultural curriculum priorities emphasised across all areas of Australia's first national curriculum released to the public in 2011. Indeed, the national curriculum only barely mentions any kind of British history at all, with absolutely no attempt to teach children about the institutional links and episodes such as the Civil War, for example. So children are completing their school years with a rudimentary knowledge, if at all, of any British history and why it's important. And if and when they go on to study history at universities, we all know they'll find the history departments wanting. So of the 746 subjects that I looked at taught across the 35 universities, only 17 of those focused on British history, which is just very, very, very bad odds, I would wager. So only 2 of those, a course at Melbourne University and a course at Monash, covered what we think would be a course that you need to know if you're studying British history or any history at all. Interestingly, in response to the audit, Melbourne University's Professor Bernard, who specialises in British history, wrote an article which was posted on The Conversation, saying that he'd love to teach more British history, but there simply isn't the demand amongst the undergraduate population. He also said, as a white male, I can categorically deny that there's no identity politics being taught at Melbourne University. And I don't know if you saw the irony of that, but so his argument that there is no demand, I think, is fallacious. How does the undergraduate population know what it wants or it doesn't want if it's lacking the knowledge in the first place? If students are being deprived of British history at school, or they're not hearing about it at home and they're not hearing about it in the public sphere, how could they possibly know what they're missing out on and thus reject once they get to university? Well, I can tell you that they're missing out on an awful lot. I'm currently reading The English and Their History by Professor Robert Toombs. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Robert Toombs, but he's one of the only 2 Cambridge historians from the entire faculty who publicly backed Brexit in 2016. And he based his arguments on his extensive knowledge of both the history of Britain and Europe. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Professor Toombs in July, and he's since agreed to come to Melbourne and Sydney next year in March as our visiting scholar for the IPA's Foundations of Western Civilization programme. And he'll be delivering 2 keynote addresses. And I know it's a long way from Perth, but if any of you are in the East, please do keep an eye out and attend, because I think there'll be fantastic talks. He's already done a great deal of thinking about how he's going to approach his discussion of Western civilization, and he's a great man. He's also written a great book. He wrote a 1,000-page monumental book of the history of England, which is just a rich 1,000-page book of facts, wit, and insight. And the more I read about the history of Britain, the more I appreciate how unique it is and how fascinating it is, and how fortunate we are in Australia to have been the beneficiary of this history and its institutions. And one thing that I'm continually struck by is just how much importance the British have placed on and continue to place on the rule of law. The rule of law, of course, has a multitude of definitions, but what I'm referring to here is specifically is that everyone, including citizens and the government, is bound by and entitled to the benefit of the laws. In Australia, we uphold the rule of law in our daily lives. It's a foundation of a fair and just society. There are numerous interactions between the rule of law and the concept of freedom. Following the law creates stability. Predictability in the law allows people to plan their behaviours around the law and gives them freedom under the law. And of course, that freedom opens the way for creativity, ingenuity, problem solving, building, improving our quality of life, and creating prosperity, all the things that the West has excelled at and continues to excel at. I think even to this day, the concept of the rule of law is deeply ingrained in the British psyche. And of course, it has had many centuries in which to become ingrained. The rule of law is the longest established common law fundamental principle of the governance of Britain, and it dates back to 1215, when King John sealed the Magna Carta, and it was in effect, a highly successful attempt to bring the king back under the law. Magna Carta was unique because it was basically a contract between the community and the monarch. It was by no means egalitarian, but it did ascribe certain rights and powers to that community, even to its humblest members. It effectively planned the system that we enjoy in Australia today. As early as 1300, the British already had a strong sense of the importance of the rule of law. They understood that the laws, rights, statutes, and property were all inherited, that they came from the past and that they needed to be upheld in order for society to function and prosper. And this point, I think, can be illustrated using the example of the plague. So when the Black Death arrived on the shores of Britain in the 1340s, it swiftly wiped out half the population. And because there was no immunity, 80% of the people who contracted it died within a couple of hours. Yet, society didn't collapse. It was shaken, but it didn't collapse. And even though half the population of London died, recent excavations of a cemetery in Smithfield showed that the bodies were buried neatly in individual graves rather than being tossed into mass pits. Society didn't collapse because King Edward and his parliaments acted vigorously to keep society running by ensuring the laws were followed. They did everything in their power to maintain the rule of law. And as they understood it, it meant requiring people to work, fulfill their obligations, and keep things as they had before. Royal courts acted to enforce agreements and payments of debts and to maintain quality of workmanship. During this period, flexible ad hoc decisions, what would develop into equity law, one of the characteristic features of British and Australian legal practice, was born. Local knights were appointed as justices of the peace, with the task of maintaining law and order and local administration. Remarkably, and this is something I didn't know, the plague also created the opportunity for prosperity and greater freedom. The population had been reduced from 6 million in 1300 to 2.5 million in 1350. Those tenants who had survived threatened to leave the land unless rents were reduced and feudal obligations were dropped. So the Black Death accelerated the end of serfdom in Britain, but on the continent it continued for another 400 years. In Britain, workers enjoyed greater freedom, moving between jobs. Young people, particularly women, were able to live independently of their parents and delay marriage and even choose their own partners. In short, society became more restless but much freer. The next 3 centuries in Britain saw momentous change. The British freed themselves from the bronze of lordship, from some of their monarchs, from the culture that predominated since the Norman conquest, from the church, and from each other. At the same time, society had to cope with wars, social and economic catastrophes, famine, plague, and massive depopulation. But during all this upheaval, neither the existence nor the unity of the nation, nor the function of its institutions was never seriously threatened. The worst civil violence in the country was always shut down, and the rule of law constantly restored. In 1600, Sir Edward Coke, English barrister and politician, resurrected the largely forgotten Magna Carta and declared it to be the fountain of all the fundamental laws of the realm and the restitution of common law. It could be argued that it was this time, in the 17th century, that the instinctive belief that the law is, or should be, more than just a collection of executive orders and directives, came into being. The concept that the law and rights embody intangible and permanent values was also established during the century, which saw the rule of law become central to British ideas